It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, everybody. I am Jeff Arbuckle, and this is Monster Mondays presented to you by Film Seizure. And this is the final week of remakes of previous movies I've covered before on Monster Mondays. This week, I'm looking at the 1995 remake of Village of the Damned. And this was directed by John Carpenter. Now, Carpenter has an interesting career, and we've covered him multiple times on Film Seizure. From talking about Halloween, Christine, and In the Mouth of Madness on the Film Seizure podcast proper, to me alone covering The Fog on this show. So I'm sure this has been discussed before, but I do want to hit some highlights on Carpenter before we dive into Village of the Damned. First up, most everyone will know Carpenter's work on Halloween. Honestly, I don't think I need to cover that pretty much at all, but from Halloween, he amassed a pretty solid group of fans. He was able to roll into the 80s with an entire decade of movies that have their own fan bases that range from the large, with movies like Big Trouble in Little China and Escape from New York, to the more cult level, like with Prince of Darkness and They Live. While not many of his movies after Halloween were all that well received by critics, fans found them, probably mostly on cable and in video stores. The one exception to all of this was 1984's Starman, which garnered high praise from critics, but barely broke even at the box office. Starman's lead actor, Jeff Bridges, was nominated for Best Actor at the Oscars, and that is the lone Oscar nomination from any of Carpenter's films. Things get a little weird in the 90s for Carpenter. He was in a bit of a battle over They Live, and he had a bunch of projects that really kind of fell through that included high-profile projects like a Dracula movie, a movie that would have starred Cher, which she herself was a major box office draw at the time, and even Exorcist III. He reluctantly made the sci-fi black comedy Memoirs of an Invisible Man starring Chevy Chase and Daryl Hannah, and it bombed hard. We'll talk about what he bounced back with in just a moment because it's absolutely relevant to this week's episode. But the later part of the 90s found Escape from LA disappoint fans of the original Escape from New York, and Vampires, which wildly divided audiences. Then in 2001, he made the universally hated Ghosts of Mars. And he didn't make another movie until 2010's The Ward, which, to be honest with you, I didn't even know really existed. And after that, he hadn't directed a movie since, despite being involved with David Gordon Green's Halloween films. It seems as though he was a master in the 70s and 80s, but something about the 90s changed either in his approach or the subject matter that seemed to kind of derail a favorite among horror fans. But there was one shining star right in the middle of that rough spot, and that's 1995's In the Mouth of Madness. And I say 1995 because even though the film was released in the fall of 94 in Italy, it didn't get released here in the United States until February of 1995. I have a very strong and vivid memory of seeing In the Mouth of Madness when it came out because I was a senior in high school. And I saw it and immediately told some of my friends they needed to go get their eyeballs on it too. It's just this weird but endlessly entertaining interdimensional horror movie that's very Lovecraftian. And you don't quite know what's real and what's not in the movie. And it's just great. Sam Neill and Julie Carmen are just fantastic in the movie. But get this. Only 6 weeks after the U.S. release of In the Mouth of Madness, Carpenter's remake of Village of the Damned made its way to theaters. Neither In the Mouth of Madness nor Village of the Damned scored very well with critics or with audiences at the time. While In the Mouth of Madness eventually did rise to cult status as far as fandom, Village of the Damned of the two is the one that has not recovered by way of that cult following. But we'll worry about that a little bit later. For me, I always knew Carpenter had a soft spot for the classics. Hell, The Thing from Another World was in the original Halloween, and he got to remake it in 1982 as The Thing. According to him, there had been attempts to remake Village of the Damned for 15 or 16 years, ever since Invasion of the Body Snatchers was successful in 1978. Lawrence Buckman, who was in charge of MGM British when the original film was released in 1960 from the studio, was really hot on the idea of remaking the movie as early as 1981. Eventually, Universal ended up with it and asked Carpenter to make the movie. Carpenter, probably employing not great reasoning, thought to himself that he'd do this because he knew the film well from seeing it when he was young and felt it was an easy movie to make. Now, I'm not sure anyone would ever say a movie was, quote, easy to make, but I digress. Carpenter did have some frustrations with the original script that was presented to him. He wanted to update the original, not completely change the story. The entire concept of it being basically an alien visitation that's really, really important to the original story from the novel and the original movie was completely excised in the script that he had, and he thought that was really pretty nuts, because not having that is not Village of the Damned. It's something else. So he ended up rewriting it to kind of add all of that stuff back in. Now, with this movie, the cast is appealing too. You have Kirstie Alley, who was a huge star on Cheers just a couple of years before this. Mark Hamill was in the film, and he hadn't really been in too much super high profile since Return of the Jedi. And thirdly, this was the final feature film of Christopher Reeve's career. On May 27th, one day shy of exactly 1 month since the theatrical release of Village of the Damned, Reeve was participating in a set of training level events at the Commonwealth Dressage and Combined Training Association finals in Culpeper, Virginia. He finished really well in the dressage event, finishing fourth. But the following day, he was going to perform in the cross-country course. He had concerns about a couple of the jumps, but at jump number 3, not one that he was concerned about because it's a fairly run-of-the-mill 3-foot jump, the horse he was riding made a refusal. And that means that a horse decides not to take a jump, usually stops dead in its tracks. This caused him to be thrown from the horse, where he landed on his head. He broke 2 vital vertebrae and was paralyzed from the neck down. He continued to act while he could, but ultimately his health would decline. He died after complications for what's likely an adverse reaction to medication that he was taking that caused cardiac arrest. He was only 52 years old. Obviously, as a child born in 1977 and did all of his growing up in the 80s, the death of Christopher Reeve, who is my Superman, was hard for me and a lot of people of my generation. He was an incredible Clark Kent and Superman, but an even better activist after his accident. The decade after the accident and before his death, Christopher and Dana Reeve would lobby for disability rights, including raising insurance caps and expansion of stem cell research. He urged voters, literally days before his death, to vote yes on a California proposition that ultimately created the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine, which would allow for billions of state-funded cash for stem cell research. So enough about that. Let's actually now talk about the movie. The movie begins with an ominous presence seemingly flying over the town of Midwich. And it is said that this is probably like Northern California. I think they say it's supposed to be in Marin County. I think this was filmed in the same town of Inverness that Carpenter lived at, and was also where he filmed The Fog. But it brings with it a shadow, this ominous presence, that also sounds like whispering. Now, one man, Dr. Alan Chaffee, who's played by Christopher Reeve, hears this whispering but can't quite make out what it is or if he even heard anything at all. Jill McGowan the principal of the town school, is overseeing a carnival for the children and has sent her husband Frank on an errand for the carnival when a mysterious 10 a.m. quote-unquote blackout occurs, making everyone and everything in the town fall asleep. Frank was out of town when the blackout occurred, but upon returning to town, he falls asleep and is killed in a car accident. Soon, government officials show up to investigate, including Dr. Susan Werner, who's played by Kirstie Alley, and epidemiologist trying to figure out what the source of the blackout is. Without fail, anyone who goes inside the stationary definition line around Midwich passes out. Now, after about 6 hours, people and animals start to wake up again, but there's something very confusing and scary for some of the residents. 10 women, including one virgin, are pregnant. So there's a pregnant virgin, but also a woman is pregnant whose husband has been overseas for a year. On top of that, the town is panicking over the pregnancies themselves. Many believe the kids will be deformed. Despite Dr. Chaffee claiming that no abnormalities have been detected in the normal tests, the town is still pretty upset. That is, until Dr. Werner says that in exchange for carrying the children to full term and regular tests, the government will pay for everything in prenatal care and provide $3,000 per mother per month allowance. This changes some of the minds of the pregnant women. However, all the pregnant women start having weird dreams. The following day, not a single woman has decided to terminate their pregnancies. Also odd is that every woman goes into labor at the exact same time, forcing the government to set up a field hospital to handle it. Melanie, the virgin, has complications and her child is stillborn, but all the other women successfully give birth to healthy babies. Dr. Werner makes off with the stillborn child and tells Dr. Chaffee that the stillborn girl died of umbilical asphyxia. Reverend George, who's played by Mark Hamill, saw her take the baby away and asks what she did with her. But Werner says that she took the baby away before any of the other mothers saw what happened. Werner and Chaffee continue to run tests, and they find some things that are odd about the physical attributes and the DNA of the children, all basically having commonalities as if all of the children share the same father. On top of that, their skin tone is pale and their hair is stark white. And oh yeah, they also have glowing eyes that can control people's minds, but we'll talk a little bit more about that here as we continue on. The first case in which we see one of the children playing with their mind powers is on Dr. Chaffee's wife, Barbara, and she's made to put her hand in a pot of boiling water by their daughter. Now, she isn't able to tell Alan what happened, but she struggles to even look at their daughter anymore. Depressed, Barbara goes to the edge of the cliff outside the Chaffee's home, and it's implied that their daughter ultimately kind of provided the nudge to force Barbara to jump to her death. Werner is questioned about the situation in Midwich, and she feels that it is in the interest of national security to keep an eye on them. In the years since their births, some interaction with the children have led to some issues and even a few suicides, but in none of these situations led to any kind of violence of any type. Now, the town also kind of feels dead and a little bit of a shell of what it once was. The children have also begun to pair off. David, who is Jill's son, the principal of the school, has no pair, as his pair was the stillborn girl from the virgin, who ultimately did not have a successful pregnancy. And he turns out over time to become the outcast of the group. They are continuously studied by Werner and team, but Mara Chaffee, the children's leader, knows that Werner is shielding her thoughts from them. Reverend George is convinced that the related accidents in the town is also being caused by the children. Meanwhile, Jill begs Dr. Chaffee to take on the role as the children's teachers. They are unable to remain in classes with regular students, and he seems to be the only one and the only adult that the children actually show some sort of reverence towards. David begins to experience and learn about emotions, and he realizes that his paired mate was the baby who didn't make it. And when he realizes that Dr. Chaffee also lost someone too, David holds his hand as a sign of empathy. This leads to Alan wanting to teach the children and try to teach them some sense of humanity. However, it's not long before Dr. Chaffee realizes there is something much, much more about sinister about these children, with at least 8 of the 9 children being very cruel and very cold in their attitude. Chaffee goes to Werner and she tells him about the other blackouts that occurred all over the globe. She has 3 theories, but it mostly lands on the third theory, being that it was probably some sort of alien parasitic type of birth. She shows Chaffee something in the basement. Melanie Roberts, the Virgin's baby, an alien fetus. Now, Werner tells Chaffee that she couldn't tell anyone else because it would have been too easy to be revealed to the children as they probe everybody's minds, and he'll have to bury what he saw as deep in his mind as possible. Mara tells her father that the children have decided to move to the barn where they were born to basically live and kind of create their own little society, if you will, kind of cut off from everybody else. It's really more for their own protection. She figures out that her father and Dr. Werner had been discussing the children, but she can't really sort out what it is that they talked about. Ultimately, the parents all take their children to the barn. As some of the parents try to resist the request of the children use their powers to kill another one of the parents, and it just kind of continues to kind of build more deaths as time goes on. Werner tells Chaffee that she was ordered to pack and leave town as soon as possible. You see, every other town that had a blackout across the world and birthed children like the Midwich kids has been destroyed without warning. Chaffee learns from his own daughter that the colonies are set up to basically live in a sort of a petri dish to kind of play out a game of survival of the fittest. He is able to block his thoughts to avoid the children learning the other towns were destroyed, but Mara demands to be moved out of the town nonetheless. Soon, Reverend George decides to take matters into his own hands to try to shoot the children, but just as he's about to shoot Mara, the other bad kids kind of realize what he's up to and forces him to shoot himself. This leads to the rest of the town to pick up torches and attack the children. At the exact same time, Werner is confronted by Mara, who forces her to show her and David and one of the other kids the dead alien fetus. Outside, several other children force Reverend George's wife, Sarah, who's the leader of the lynch mob, to basically burn herself alive with her own torch. Inside the clinic, Mara forces Werner to cut herself with a scalpel, similar to how the alien's autopsy body was cut open, and she dies from the self-inflicted wound. The town reels from Sarah's death, and the state police attempt to take control of the town as Alan collects explosives in his own plot to kill the children. He tells Jill about how he was able to block Mara from seeing his thoughts. He then kisses Jill goodbye and locks her inside of her office to prevent her from trying to stop him. The police come and starts a standoff between a couple of cops and the kids, but Mara uses one of the cops to start killing everybody else who arrives, serving as backup. It's basically a bloodbath that causes the cops to fight amongst themselves. The only child not participating in any of this is David, who is ultimately hiding in the barn. By the time Alan gets to the barn, all the cops and military people sent to get the kids are dead. Alan begins using a brick wall to block their thoughts, and tries to get David to go outside to get a notebook in his car so he can deal with the rest of the children with his bomb. This angers all the children except for David. While he continues to fight them, Jill is able to sneak into the barn after escaping her office and tries to rescue her son. And the children continue to try to break through Alan's defense, and it takes David standing up to Mara to give Jill and David the time to get out before the bomb goes off, just as the kids find out that the bomb exists. Later, as they are driving away, Jill and David leave town, where she tells David that they'll plan to settle someplace where no one knows who they are. So let's start talking about the three things that I like about John Carpenter's Village of the Damned. First up, I really like the first 20 or so minutes of this movie. There's this lovely calm before the blackout that's well set up. We get to see Dr. Chaffee's confidence and intelligence. We meet Jill McGowan, who is just starting out as principal and is very much in love with her husband, Frank. We get these little, flashes, but suddenly it all goes down. And what we can't really easily see in the original is the thing that inevitably comes to mind whenever something like an entire town falls asleep at once for 6 hours would bring up. For example, what if you were driving a car? One question beyond that is, what if you were cooking hot dogs on the grill and you fall forward onto the grill and you fell asleep? What happens if you are in a precarious position, like on a bike or on a ladder? We get to actually see people die as a result of those things that we can only think about, but had to brush off and brush aside because the 1960s movie couldn't cover that, and the story had to move on without those answers. We're introduced to Jack McGowan, who's played by Michael Paré, and he's not someone that I have a great deal of history of liking in movies, and he's great in this movie, but he's dead barely 2 minutes after the credits. It's a shock and has a great effect on one of the main characters of this movie, so all of that setup is wonderful. The second like that I have is how well this movie not only updates the 1960 film, but also the original novel, which the first film was closely adapting. There's this added alien baby thing that feels very mid-90s, what with all the alien autopsies being a big reality TV thing at the time, and the inclusion of this other entity that is the government, creating a sense of distrust and uneasiness that lies under the surface of this movie. While Kirstie Alley's Dr. Werner seems hard-edged and possibly not trustworthy, she actually was acting in the best interest of the town and the people who suddenly had these kids. But her character doesn't exactly give off the friendliest attitude, so it just adds to the disruption of this originally very pleasant and happy little town. Overall, I find this to be incredibly faithful, at least to the 1960 movie. I said earlier that Carpenter appreciated the film as he saw it when he was like 12 or 13 years old. I find it odd that he now says that he didn't really have that much passion for this movie and that it was a contractual obligation to Universal. I feel like if that was really true, he wouldn't have rewritten the script to make it more like the original story and legitimately recreate some of the shots that featured the children. There are people really trying to bring something to the movie to make it a worthy remake and update to the older film. If his heart wasn't in it, I think there would have been a different end product here. But thirdly, I really like the kids in this movie. They were creepy, they were pitch perfect in their delivery of these kind of emotionless little kids who are instantly more intelligent than their own parents, and a couple of them were able to move on to other roles later in life. In particular, most of the burden of this movie is on two young actors, Lindsay Hahn playing Mara and Thomas Dekker playing David. David is the kid whose soul is being fought over between Linda Kozlowski's Jill and the other children. So Dekker has to shoulder a lot of the burden of experiencing things the other 8 children don't, and that includes empathy. Empathy is a an emotion or mindset or whatever it is that is just something you do if you can do it. It's not an easy thing to say, okay, kid, in this scene, you're going to act empathetic to what this other character is feeling or saying. That's hard for an adult to do. But there are times that Decker must do that in this movie. However, on the flip side, you have Hans Mara, who is basically evil incarnate. She carries the burden of being the main voice for the 9 children. She has to speak without revealing emotion. She has to remain steady and cold. And what's more is she does something extremely creepy in the final act. She's telling Christopher Reeve that they've decided to leave town, and she tells him to make arrangements to get them out of the town. She also says that his morals and ethics will basically make it impossible for him to say no, which is true. During this exchange, she switches from her cold demeanor to this kind of daddy's little girl smile and lilt to her voice. It's creepy because it's preying upon a parent's duty to their children. The other thing about her in particular, since she is the voice of the 9 children, she has to be cold and emotionless without being robotic. She's an alien, not a robot. It's really easy to tell someone to say something or act in a way that is emotionless, and for that person to turn it into a robot. These kids were well coached and well directed. And I'll admit, I hadn't seen this movie in 25 years and fully expected to not like it just based on its reputation over the years. But I actually quite like this movie. It does have a few flaws and therefore really cannot be considered better than the 1960 version, but I definitely appreciate the film as the faithful update that it is. So that wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. Don't forget to check out new episodes of Film Seizure every Wednesday and a new installment of Monster Mondays each Monday on filmseizure.com, as well as places where fine podcasts are found like SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, TuneIn, Audible, and Spotify. Additionally, hop on over to Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram to follow us by just searching for Film Seizure. And while you're at it, head on over to my website, bmovieenema.com, to read new text articles each and every Friday morning. You can also follow B-Movie Enema on Facebook and Twitter by searching for just that, B-Movie Enema. And hey, why not go over to YouTube and subscribe to the B-Movie Enema channel, where you can find episodes of the movie hosting show that I do and see a bunch of clips that I grab and use for articles. Be sure to come back throughout the rest of this year, because starting next week, I'll be talking about the big plans that I have been kind of teasing over these last several weeks for the future of Monster Mondays. But until next week, stay spooky.